plastic Pat. Now, what's that kind of thing?
Well, you know, I don't read everything, and also I think they've had some very nice articles which have been sent to me by the authoress. But anyway, they don't bother me. In fact, I look over criticism very carefully and think maybe I should improve on this, that, or the other.
Other people have said that you may be a very lonely person.
I enjoy what I do tremendously.
My mother was a saint. And I think of her, 2 boys dying of tuberculosis.
September 23, 1952. A theater in Los Angeles called the El Capitan. A 39-year-old senator named Richard Nixon is about to go on live television and fight for his political life. He's been accused of taking money from wealthy donors on the side. A secret fund, the papers called it. And Dwight Eisenhower, the man running for president with him, is seriously thinking about dropping him from the ticket. So, Nixon does something almost nobody had done before. He goes on national TV and he opens up his entire life to 60 million total strangers. Now here's the part most folks don't know. 6 feet to his left, sitting in a chair that looks like it was built for someone twice her size, is his wife, Pat. And she has no idea what he's about to say. Nobody had walked her through it. No preview, no heads up, nothing. She found out what her husband's defense was going to sound like at the exact same moment the rest of the country did, live, on camera, with nowhere to look but straight ahead and try to hold her face together. For half an hour, Nixon lays it all out. Their mortgage, the loan on his life insurance, the age of their Oldsmobile. And then comes the line that would follow Pat Nixon for the rest of her life. He tells America that his wife doesn't own a mink coat. Just, in his words, a respectable Republican cloth coat. It worked. The speech saved him. Eisenhower kept him on the ticket, and Richard Nixon rode it all the way to the vice presidency. But something in Pat didn't come back from that night the same way. Her bank account, her wardrobe, her private dignity, all of it had just become evidence in her husband's trial by television. And here's the thing, that speech wasn't a one-time thing, it set the pattern. Because for the next 20 years, whenever Richard Nixon needed to prove to the country that he was an honest, hard-working, decent man, the proof he reached for was Pat. Her thrift, her loyalty, her willingness to sit there and take it. People close to her later said she never really got over it, and for the rest of his life, Richard reportedly never brought up that date around her. So how does a woman end up in that chair? How does a marriage get to a place where a wife's whole private life gets handed over to 60 million strangers, and she just sits there and endures it? To answer that, we've got to go back. Back before the Senate, before Eisenhower, before politics ever showed up at their door. Back to a dusty little truck farm in California, where a 12-year-old girl just lost her mother and is about to learn, way too early, how to survive on her own. If you enjoy these stories and you'd like to go a little deeper, I put together a 3-book collection on the private side of some of America and Britain's most powerful families. One book looks at the marriages. One looks at how these families really lived behind closed doors, and one looks at what it was like for their children growing up around power and public attention. All 3 books are available together for just a few cups of coffee, and I've also included 4 surprise gifts for you as a little extra thank you. And just so you know, a part of your purchase would go to those in need. So, if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can use the link in the channel description or simply scan the code on your screen. Now, let's get back to our story. Her name, before it was Nixon, was Thelma Catherine Ryan. Everybody called her Pat. She grew up poor, first in a rough Nevada mining town, then on a small truck farm outside Los Angeles. At 12, she lost her mother to cancer and took over running the household. At 17, she lost her father too. To pay her own way through college, she worked as a typist, a phone operator, an X-ray technician, whatever paid. By the time she came out the other side, she had a degree, a teaching job, and something she'd fought hard for and wasn't looking to give up, her independence. Richard Nixon came from a different kind of hard. A Quaker family in Whittier, California, always scraping by, two of his brothers dead before their time. Where Pat's response to hardship was to quietly power through it, Richard's was to come out swinging, ambition as armor. They met in 1937 at a community theater tryout in Whittier, and by all accounts, Richard fell hard, fast. He asked her to marry him on their very first date. She said no. He kept showing up anyway, writing her poems, calling her his wild Irish gypsy, even driving her into Los Angeles so she could go out with other men, just so he'd get to drive her home afterward. It's a strange kind of persistence, when you think about it, but it worked. And what's easy to forget, looking back through Watergate and everything after, the letters Richard wrote Pat during those early years, especially once the war took him overseas, are genuinely tender. He wrote her almost every day for over a year. One letter that survived, from Thanksgiving of 1943, reads less like a politician and more like a young man completely wrapped up in a woman he can't stop thinking about. They married on June 21, 1940, at the Mission Inn in Riverside. And whatever came later, this part matters. This wasn't a business arrangement dressed up as a marriage. It was two people who'd both learned young how to survive on grit, deciding to survive together instead. But grit was about to get tested in a way neither of them saw coming. Because the same year their first daughter was born, Richard Nixon ran for Congress, and won. And from that point forward, the man Pat had married started belonging more and more to everybody else. Congress led to the Senate. The Senate led to Eisenhower picking him for vice president in 1952. And through all of it, Pat became something close to a professional at the one job she'd never actually applied for: political wife. She was good at it too. She traveled the world, charmed foreign leaders, held her own on diplomatic tours most second ladies would have buckled under. But being good at something and wanting it are two different things, and reporters at the time gave her a nickname that stuck for decades: Plastic Pat. A jab at that frozen campaign smile, like she was some kind of mannequin instead of a woman who'd simply learned, the hard way, to keep her feelings off her face in public. Then came 1960. Nixon ran for president against a young senator named John F. Kennedy, and lost, barely, painfully, by a margin so thin it haunted him for years. For Pat, that defeat didn't just sting. Family members and biographers later described it as the moment something in her attitude toward his political career genuinely hardened. She had given years to this: campaigns, travel, her whole private life laid out for public consumption. And there was no trophy waiting at the end of it. 2 years later, Richard ran for governor of California anyway, a race Pat, by most accounts, did not want him to enter. He lost that one too, and the morning after, he stood in front of reporters and delivered the line that would follow him for years. They wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. For Pat, that sounded like a promise. They moved to New York. She furnished an apartment. For the first time in over a decade, it looked like she might actually get the life she'd been waiting for. It didn't last. In 1968, Richard decided to run for president again, and this time Pat wasn't consulted. She was informed. During that campaign, a journalist named Gloria Steinem got a rare moment alone with her, and Pat, usually so careful, so controlled, let something slip. She talked about a life spent working instead of dreaming, about never having had the luxury of imagining who she might have become if things had gone differently. Nixon won, and in January of 1969, Richard and Pat Nixon walked into the White House together, at the absolute peak of American political power. For Pat, it would turn out to be something closer to a very well-decorated cage. Inside the White House, Pat Nixon was, by every public measure, one of the most active first ladies in American history. She became the first sitting first lady to publicly back the Equal Rights Amendment, She pushed her husband, quietly but persistently, to put a woman on the Supreme Court. Behind that camera-ready smile was a far more independent, more progressive woman than the plastic Pat label ever gave her credit for. But away from the cameras, something much colder was taking shape. Richard and Pat kept separate bedrooms. Publicly, Pat explained it simply. Richard was a restless sleeper, up at all hours flipping on lights, scribbling notes, talking into his tape recorder. Fair enough, maybe, but the distance didn't stop at the bedroom door. Richard's chief of staff, a man named H.R. Haldeman, had built what insiders came to call the German Wall around the president, a tightly controlled inner circle that filtered almost everything reaching Richard Nixon. And that wall didn't just keep out rival advisors and unwanted visitors. It kept out his own wife, household matters, social schedules, even simple conversations that most married couples would just have over dinner. Richard routed them through Haldeman instead. Two people, living down the same hallway of the same house, communicating through typed memos carried by a secretary. Haldeman's own diaries tell you exactly how he saw her. He referred to the First Lady, dismissively, as Thelma, her birth name, never the one America knew her by. He wrote about handling the PN thing the way you'd write about a scheduling headache. And here's what makes this particularly hard to sit with. Pat Nixon had one of the sharpest instincts for people in that entire administration. She had a track record of spotting manipulators and flatterers long before her husband caught on. She was, in a very real sense, exactly the kind of person a man surrounded by yes-men needs close by. Instead, she was locked out of the room where it mattered. In June of 1972, 5 men were arrested for breaking into a building in Washington called the Watergate. Nobody in the West Wing thought much of it. A strange little story, the kind that usually blows over in a week. It didn't blow over, but for a while you'd have never known it. That November, Richard Nixon won re-election in one of the biggest landslides in American history. 49 states. A mandate like almost no president before him had ever gotten. For Pat, after everything, the humiliations, the losses, the years of feeling like the ground kept shifting under her, this must have looked, finally, like vindication, like all of it had been worth something. It wasn't. Within months, the break-in that nobody had thought much of started tearing the administration apart from the inside. By 1973 and into 1974, it was clear the whole thing traced straight back to Nixon's own campaign, and as the walls closed in, people around him started noticing changes. Aides described him drinking in the afternoons, his speech slurred, his eyes glassy. One of his own cabinet secretaries later said he looked like a wind-up doll running down. Pat pulled inward too, spending long stretches of those days alone in what staff called her pale yellow bedroom. When she and Richard did sit down to dinner together, the silence between them got so heavy the staff would rush the meal along just to put both of them out of their misery. Pat was expected, required really, to keep defending her husband publicly, smile for the cameras, tell reporters she believed in him. And she did. But she was doing it without knowing the full truth of what he'd actually done. She found out the same way most Americans did, through the newspapers, through the evening news. And yet, locked out of the inner circle as she was, her instincts hadn't dulled one bit. When she learned about the secret taping system Richard had installed in the Oval Office, every conversation, every meeting, sitting on reels in the basement, she understood immediately, faster than his own lawyers did, exactly what those tapes could do to him. She told him to burn them, while they were still, technically, his own private property. Treat them like old love letters, she reportedly argued. Destroy them before anyone with a subpoena got the chance to ask. Richard didn't listen. He believed the tapes would clear his name, not bury it. It's one of the strangest ironies in the whole story. The one person whose gut instinct was dead right, the woman who'd spent decades being kept out of the room where decisions got made, handed him the one piece of advice that might have saved him, and he brushed it off. By the summer of 1974, the Supreme Court ordered the tapes turned over. There was no more hiding them, no more choice left in the matter. What was on those reels was about to become public record, and Pat Nixon was about to hear, in her own husband's recorded voice, exactly what she'd been standing beside all along. The transcripts came out that summer, and they were ugly. Cold discussions about hush money, long stretches of expletives blacked out by the censors, but plenty left showing anyway. This wasn't the careful, controlled Richard Nixon the country had watched for 25 years. This was a man plotting a cover-up in his own words, recorded by his own machine. Pat read them. By most accounts, she never opened those transcripts a second time. With impeachment now all but certain, Pat gave her husband one more piece of advice. "Don't resign," she told him. "Take it to trial in the Senate. Don't hand them the easy way out." She believed stepping down would leave him wide open to criminal charges the moment he walked out the door. Once again, Richard didn't take her advice. On August 8, 1974, he addressed the nation and announced he was resigning the presidency. The next morning, he gathered his staff in the East Room for a final farewell address, his voice breaking as he spoke about his own parents and the value of a life built on more than just success. Pat stood near him through it, holding herself together in front of the cameras one last time. Afterward, the family walked out to the White House lawn. Richard turned at the top of the steps to Marine One, raised both arms in that familiar double wave, and then it was over. The helicopter lifted off, and the presidency they had spent 22 years building together was finished. Think about what that moment actually was for her. This was the same woman who'd sat frozen through the Checkers broadcast, silently enduring the first great public sacrifice of her marriage. And here she was again, in front of the same kind of cameras, enduring the last one, except this time there was no coat, no dog, no speech that could save them, just a wave, and a helicopter, and California waiting on the other end of the flight. They landed in San Clemente, and for the first time in almost 30 years, the machinery around them disappeared. No more chief of staff building walls between them. No more press office managing her image. No more campaigns waiting on the calendar. Just two people who'd spent nearly their entire adult lives performing for the public, suddenly left alone with each other in the quiet. And that quiet, at first, wasn't peaceful. It was a reckoning. The stress of everything that had just happened started showing up in both of their bodies almost right away. Richard nearly died from a blood clot condition not long after leaving office. Pat, still carrying the weight of everything she'd swallowed in silence for so many years, was about to pay a price of her own. In July of 1976, Pat Nixon suffered a serious stroke. Her daughter Julie later said it came not long after reading a book about her father's final, unraveling days in the White House. Reliving it all on the page, apparently, was more than her mother's body could absorb quietly. But here's where the story does something you might not expect. In the years that followed, away from Washington, away from the staff and the schedules and the cameras, Richard Nixon slowed down. The man who'd once run everything through memos and intermediaries started walking Pat along the beach himself. He nursed her through her recovery. Whatever the presidency had cost their marriage, the two of them spent their final years learning, finally, how to just be married. Quietly, privately, without an audience. Pat never gave another interview for the rest of her life. She wouldn't take part in Richard's long campaign to rebuild his public reputation. After nearly 30 years of standing in front of cameras defending him, she decided no one, not even her own husband, could talk her into doing it one more time. Her silence, the same silence politics had once forced onto her, became something she finally chose for herself. On June 22, 1993, Pat Nixon died at their home in New Jersey. It was exactly one day after their 53rd wedding anniversary. Richard Nixon, a man famous for guarding his emotions his entire public life, wept openly at her funeral. 10 months later, he was gone too. So, what do we actually make of all this? A 53-year marriage that started with a young lawyer chasing a school teacher who kept saying no, that survived a live television broadcast about a cloth coat and a family dog, that got walled off by its own staff inside the White House, and that finally cracked wide open under the weight of a scandal she wasn't even told the full truth about. It wasn't a fairy tale. The record doesn't support that. But it wasn't an empty, loveless arrangement either. The record doesn't support that version any better. What it was is something a whole lot harder to sum up in one sentence. Two people who genuinely cared for each other, whose ambition and endurance built an extraordinary life together, and whose, that same ambition and endurance slowly cost them the ordinary one they might have had instead. Pat Nixon spent 53 years standing beside a man she seems to have truly loved, even while his ambition kept demanding more from her than she ever intended to give. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know what you think. Would you have stayed? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy these deeply researched looks into the real marriages behind American history, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a lot more of these stories still to tell. If you enjoy these stories and you'd like to go a little deeper, I put together a 3-book collection on the private side of some of America and Britain's most powerful families. One book looks at the marriages, one looks at how these families really lived behind closed doors, and one looks at what it was like for their children growing up around power and public attention. All 3 books are available together for just a few cups of coffee, and I've also included 4 surprise gifts for you as a little extra thank you. And just so you know, a part of your purchase would go to those in need. So, if that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can use the link in the channel description or simply scan the code on your screen. See you in the next story.